One of the things I felt strongly about was getting the audience as well as other teachers to buy into the fact that students need interactive learning in order to progress. And I tend to think about this in a visual manner. So I chose this slide that shows an active brain versus an inactive brain. And much like sedentary lifestyles versus active lifestyles, the brain needs exercise. As Albert Einstein said, the formulation of a problem is often more essential than its solution, which may be merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. And then I have the little cartoon to the right that says, I detect no brain activity. I wonder how much brain activity sometimes goes on in the classroom and how this is instrumental in reaching our students, whether it be math or another subject matter. So as we begin to look at gaining buy-in to different types of teaching techniques, especially with math, I want to begin the review of the article that I read. The purpose of the article was a 4-phase study that determined which of 3 instructional methods taught to secondary students with emotional and behavior disorders yielded the best student assessment results. The study was a single subject design with alternating random treatments used to compare the 3 methods as follows. And they randomly offered these methods. The only problem was it was interrupted with some days out of school as well as vacation time. So it was probably not an ideal situation, but it did provide a start for some discussion. The 3 techniques were direct teach, or what I would refer to as direct instruction, computer-assisted instruction, CAI, and a combination of both direct instruction and CAI. Procedures for behavior management systems were in place as well as observer reliability and procedural integrity observed. In other words, it was a very valid and reliable study, and it did encourage further studies along this line of instruction. I think when we begin to teach and try different techniques, it's important for us to self-assess as teachers. Once we take a look at where we came from, we might better be able to relate to the students and where they are coming from as diverse learners and their needs in the classroom. The questions we need to ask ourselves as a teacher is, are the students eagerly starting their work when I begin? Instruction, do students persevere? They want to know more knowledge, and do the students retain the information? Or do I get done explaining information and they're immediately asking questions of information I just went over? Also, are students persevering and wanting and learning new vocabulary? Have they created systems to retain this vocabulary from day to day and hour to hour? And on a final note, are the students eager to problem solve and test their thoughts and hypotheses? Are students eager to share with each other their thoughts and opinions? If so, then maybe they are engaged in the learning process. I found this poster on Facebook, and I think one of the things we need to think about is described in this poster, that perhaps the reason teens isolate themselves in a classroom, particularly, or among peers, particularly with their phones or other mechanisms of isolation and avoidance, is that maybe they're overwhelmed instead of coming to us for help with their problems. Maybe this is because when they're toddlers, we do isolate them when they're overwhelmed instead of helping them with their problems. It just brings out the question is, are we as teachers helping with their problems, or are we asking them to conform to our problem of making sure they meet state assessments and guidelines? As a teacher, it's important to think back of when you were learning kindergarten through 12 and what classes did you like best and why. I still remember one of my instructors, Mr. Dodgen, singing to the jazz singer. He was a rather eccentric man, very unique, rather odd, but always very visual with his hands and his voice and his drama, which really helped engage me in the learning process. Some of us are hands-on learners. Some experiment or learn from books. And other questions we need to ask ourselves as teachers: were we good at both geometry and algebra, or maybe just one versus the other? In engaging teachers to begin to think about different processes, I think they need to ask themselves and share amongst themselves to find out that we all learn with different styles. Again, thinking about the different varieties and ways of learning as teachers, it's important to realize that we also have various personalities, as do the students. And sometimes student to teacher matches are not as great as they could be. And we as teachers, I think, are the ones that need to take the step to meet the student needs. We are in the business of selling education and engaging the students to meet their needs. Students are like us, and we all do learn in different ways. A question I would ask teachers to think about is, would you have been more motivated to learn with options, choices, and hands-on projects, self-promoted projects, or just reading a textbook? I think we all know the answer, and although it's more work sometimes in the beginning to create hands-on projects, once we have the students up and moving around and engaged, and we're simply observing their discoveries and their sharing with their peers, it is more difficult in the beginning, but in the end it tends to be a little bit more simple because the students have learned the information and we are less available for direct instruction and lecture. As a teacher, as we begin to engage in change towards maybe a more universal design and teaching more to the diverse needs of the students, it's important to ask teachers overall what is frustrating about teaching and try to meet some of their needs as teachers before we begin to ask them to change. It's important to ask teachers, how can students help the teachers, and make a list of that, and maybe how they can help out students to make their lives a little easier as teachers. Overall, analyzing and problem-solving answers to these questions as teachers will help eliminate some of the frustrations and problem solve and create some sort of a rubric or a flow chart to move towards more engaged learning. One might also consider a task force to look at options to increase student engagement and learning. The important part is that teachers are heavily involved in creating that learning environment that is ideal for diverse learners. Once we have realized that students have needs and their needs are unique, we must identify effective instructional design features, especially with math. We must create methods and strategies that are student-driven, as in this picture where they're discussing, measuring, and creating. And it's important to integrate peer instruction and problem-solving strategies that do not require teacher or my constant intervention. This allows for individuality to projects, as well as frees up time for me to supervise a variety of student activities. Overall, it's important to consider universal design in teaching math and helping make sense of the content. First, if a student isn't learning a particular core indicator, one needs to consider if it is a class issue or a school-wide issue. I have noticed that in our school, geometry seems to be a word that comes up frequently, especially with our new curriculum. Sounds like it's not just associated with one particular class or grade level, but maybe even a district-wide issue. Something that hasn't been taught in the younger classes and grade levels and now is really surfacing with the new curriculum for middle school and elementary school. Another thing to think about is explicit instruction with step-by-step examples and procedures to provide and develop a systematic approach to learning in your classroom. This was correlated with the study that I reviewed, in which direct instruction is very important and should use models and examples so that even parents can help their children with new learning strategies. Things need to be very step by step, so much that anybody can pick up where the teacher left off. On a final note, it's important to provide annotated models, use voice patterns, video narration. Some technology could maybe be sunk in there. Provide movement in the class and sharing with the peers to create stimuli in learning and problem solving. I kind of correlate this with drama, singing, chanting, moving around, and video and some technology such as the Wii can often help with this. One thing I noticed in the review of the article for effective instruction that I learned was that in 2008, this article noted that few studies provided meta-analysis of math interventions and which proved that students are still lacking instructional gains. And this is in despite of No Child Left Behind in the efforts to focus on mandates to increase accountability, especially with those with disabilities. In other words, they were mandating things, gathering groups, trying to make changes, but yet the interventions were still lacking, and we're still needing to look at more instructional methods as opposed to mandates to move our youth forward. One of the final things I noticed from the article that correlated with our readings this time around was that it is important to fade from new content. I learn it, you learn it, we learn it sort of stuff, and have it become more student-driven learning. I will use my goal would be to use antecedent supports, provide frequent, more immediate, and more elaborate corrective feedback in the beginning to confirm knowledge with the student of math concepts. Then the goal would then be provide more subtle fading of antecedent support for correct responding and back off with frequently monitored and correcting and possibly responding and understanding. As the week goes on or the concepts are fading and we're moving to something new, I would begin to finalize understanding, encourage more opportunities for practice and group work with peer challenges and sharing of ideas and concepts, where the student begins to take ownership of their knowledge and sharing and feeling a part of a group, that they are a valid and important part of the knowledge and the sharing. Hello, I'm Susan Brown Morgan, And the article I chose, it was a peer-reviewed article off the KU Library website, was Comparison of 3 Instructional Methods for Teaching Math Skills to Secondary Students with Emotional and Behavioral Disorders. I shared the link, and I enjoyed the article. It was a simplistic review, and it also highlighted the fact that there have not been many studies regarding strategies for reaching students other than the traditional textbook methods, as well as the fact that there is need for further research involving computer-assisted instruction. Again, the use of direct instruction was highly emphasized in the article that I reviewed, as well as in our coursework this week. We've talked about direct instruction. It should be explicit instruction with almost all individualized students for successful learning experience. Students need individualized, tweaked plans that meet their needs individually. I also would present student-related materials structured to individuals and their choices. I think if students are given choices, they're more likely to participate, especially when they have some input on a project or the learning of the information. I also would provide a systematic daily review of key material and numerous opportunities for response from students and interactive and repetitive practice of math-related materials, because students with disabilities need this repetition and reminders for retention and for processing of information. Their working memory is not as strong as it could be, and therefore the use of graphic organizers and various teaching of vocabulary in different styles, visuals and models, flashcards, and references will help them be able to transfer the knowledge from day to day into the real world setting. The second component of the article that was studied was the use of computer-assisted instruction, or referred to as CAI. Use pictures and scenarios to reinforce verbal communication concepts. This is very useful, as well as different programs that we're finding on the computers these days, where the students can be a bit more engaged in the learning process with technology. The article I read did caution, as with other articles, that CAI as research has lacked and has not a lot of research showing its impact on learning and progress with students. And CAI with reading did improve in this particular study compared with those who had no reading model conditioning. Overall, use efficacy with students before making a blanket. Use efficacy with students before making a blanket approach to using computer-assisted instruction, period. This study that I reviewed, and I would hope that teachers begin to think about, is the fact that the best teaching scenario is one that uses direct instruction and also uses computer-assisted technology to blend learning styles to meet the needs of all student learners in a diverse setting. This particular article described the best way to carry out direct instruction and computer-assisted instruction using universal teaching designs, and that it's important to determine what to teach, to determine how to teach it based on the students, and to evaluate the effects of instruction and making subsequent instructional decisions. In other words, we need to adapt as needed per student needs. Student need drives instructional intensity. If a student needs something, then we are here to market it to them. That's how we're going to captivate them and get them involved. Students with disabilities are likely to need even more intensive instruction, but they still have a need to learn and a desire to learn. We must anticipate student identity and any particular learning issues and troubleshoot difficulties. We must use and reuse vocabulary, syntax, and semantics used in math more frequently, as they can be barriers to those with cultural and linguistic challenges as well. Ask students to restate what they heard to determine whether what they heard is what I intended for them to learn. I might restate or paraphrase statements that made by the students to check for understanding, and I might use pictures, objects, and gestures, as I mentioned before, a little more drama to reinforce verbal communication and help visualize retention of information. Last but not least, together, I firmly believe, and based on the articles that are beginning to take place and studies that are beginning to take place, students and teachers can make progress, especially when students are given an initiative and a choice. After reading this article, I feel I can make a difference by sharing strategies such as reading aloud, student monitoring of their own progress, and helping students chart their progress and performance on target concepts and math skills with goal setting. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. It was a little more lengthy. It takes me back to watching one of my daughter's fourth grade teachers, in which every year is a new year. And as a special ed teacher, she is very quick to adapt to the needs of each and every student. If there's a large body of ELA, then we must create a new program for them. If there are several ADHD, we must conform the assignments so that it can help engage them to their optimal level. I hope that as a teacher you might be more motivated to make these changes and to begin to sell education to meet the needs of each of your students. Thank you.